Les estuvimos dando mucha lata de que trataran de estar temprano para empezar temprano, así que les agradecemos mucho a los que llegaron con mucha anterioridad y no quisiéramos seguir alargando el inicio, así que bueno, vamos a dar inicio ahorita a la sesión y pues bueno, ya que las demás personas se puedan ir también integrando conforme vayan llegando. Pues nos da muchísimo gusto poder recibir aquí a Mariel Beasley. Habíamos estado intentando de que viniera desde el año pasado, cuando hicimos el coloquio, pero bueno, no se pudo el año pasado y estamos muy contentos de que esté aquí con nosotros el día de hoy. Voy a hacer una breve introducción también y un poco sobre todo para las personas que no nos pudieron acompañar en la primera conferencia de este ciclo. Pensamos que era importante hacer una pequeña introducción. Entonces, como saben, esta es la segunda conferencia de nuestro ciclo sobre sesgos cognitivos y esferas de injusticia. Y pues bueno, antes que nada también quiero agradecer nuevamente a todas las personas que nos han estado apoyando para llevar a cabo este ciclo. En primer lugar al doctor Luis de la Barreda, el coordinador del Programa Universitario de Derechos Humanos, al doctor Keno Llama, también secretario de la Secretaría de Desarrollo Institucional, el doctor Alberto Vital, coordinador de la Coordinación de Humanidades, y finalmente también a nuestro anfitrión, el doctor Pedro Salazar, quien reiteradamente nos ha facilitado el poder hacer estas sesiones aquí en el instituto. Y pues bueno, como les comentaba, para todos aquellos que no estuvieron en la conferencia pasada, les quiero decir que este ciclo de conferencias es resultado del interés sobre sesgos cognitivos que surgió a raíz del primer coloquio sobre discriminación, sesgos cognitivos y derechos humanos que llevamos a cabo el año pasado en noviembre. Y pues bueno, también es importante que comentar que estos temas ya son parte de una nueva investigación que se está impulsando en la UNAM sobre la experimentación en torno a la cognición social, la discriminación y la injusticia en nuestro país. En la sesión pasada tuvimos la oportunidad de escuchar al doctor Jeffrey Rachinsky, quien nos habló acerca de los estudios que ha realizado con jueces federales en Estados Unidos para identificar sus sesgos cognitivos y cómo estos pueden reflejarse en acciones judiciales injustas. Sesgos de confirmación y de anclaje, sesgos relacionados con el género, con la raza, con la pertenencia geográfica, fueron algunos de los mecanismos cognitivos identificados y que se reflejan en sentencias que reproducen estereotipos y prejuicios que afectan sistemáticamente a diferentes grupos. En esta ocasión hemos invitado a la maestra Beasley porque queremos explorar otra esfera que también es precursora de grandes desigualdades en el ámbito social. Y me refiero a la esfera de la inclusión financiera. Según el Consejo Nacional de Inclusión Financiera, esta se define como el acceso y uso de servicios financieros formales bajo una regulación apropiada que garantice esquemas de protección al consumidor y promueva la educación financiera para mejorar la capacidad financiera de todos los segmentos de la población. Es una definición, por decir, rimbombante, pero en realidad el objetivo de la inclusión financiera es mejorar la posibilidad de que todas las personas puedan acceder a recursos financieros que les permitan mejorar sus vidas y satisfacer sus necesidades. En muchos países alrededor del mundo, la definición de la inclusión financiera está más enfocada a asegurar el acceso a aquellos sectores de la población que se encuentran fuera de los servicios formales. Esta debería de ser la definición más específica en un país como México, el cual presenta grandes retos para la población con mayores niveles de vulnerabilidad. Según el Global Findex Report del 2017 del Banco Mundial, en México las personas no acceden a los servicios financieros y se debe básicamente porque o no cuentan con recursos, los servicios son muy caros, no confían en las instituciones, se encuentran geográficamente lejos o no cuentan con la documentación requerida. Por su parte, la Encuesta Nacional de Inclusión Financiera, realizada el año pasado por el INEGI y la Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, también muestra claros oscuros. Por un lado, han mejorado los indicadores sobre el número de personas con al menos una cuenta de banco, que es casi el 70%, aunque un porcentaje muy bajo utiliza esta cuenta para ahorrar. Del total de población mayor de 18 años, menos del 40% de la población ahorra y solo el 16% lo hace en una institución financiera, es decir, en algún banco, lo cual es bajísimo, ¿no? Los niveles a nivel internacional, digamos, sobre todo en países desarrollados, está alrededor del 80-85%, lo cual es mucha la diferencia. Los esquemas obligatorios de ahorro para el retiro han ayudado a que en 2018 40% de la población contara con este mecanismo, aunque solo 5% de esta población logra hacer depósitos voluntarios, lo cual también es bajísimo. En ambos indicadores hay una ligera mejora en cuestiones de desigualdad de género, pero todavía no es suficiente. Uno de los indicadores más importantes es el acceso al crédito. Este está asociado con la disminución de los niveles de pobreza y el crecimiento económico. En México, solo el 31% de la población tiene acceso a alguna forma de crédito y básicamente la mayor cantidad de crédito es a partir de tarjetas departamentales o tarjetas de crédito, lo que significa que no tiene fines productivos o patrimoniales. Solo el 22% de la población cuenta con créditos para vivienda. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Que el 70% de la población no tiene acceso a créditos formales y que el 80% no tiene acceso a créditos para comprar una vivienda. El Banco Mundial y el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, así como muchas organizaciones internacionales, han estudiado a profundidad la importancia en el acceso al crédito, en especial en la población en extrema pobreza, y la gran oportunidad que representa para salir de ella. En México, hace 20, 30 años, los microcréditos estaban de moda y tanto organizaciones civiles como internacionales impulsaban microcréditos y esquemas de ahorro en todas las regiones del país. Sin embargo, el mal manejo de muchos de estos programas, el fortalecimiento hegemónico de la banca internacional y su alianza con las élites políticas y económicas, así como la era de las transferencias directas para aliviar la pobreza, dejaron en manos del mercado la inclusión financiera. Y por lo que muestran los indicadores, esta no se ha logrado. En un entorno social con bajos niveles de ahorro y crédito, es difícil mejorar los índices de pobreza y disminuir los niveles de vulnerabilidad. Consideramos que el trabajo que está realizando Mariel Beasley y sus colegas en el Common Sense Lab aporta nuevos elementos desde la economía del comportamiento para entender las barreras a las que se enfrentan las personas más vulnerables para ahorrar y acceder a servicios financieros. También nos alertan acerca de que los cambios de comportamiento no se requieren únicamente en los usuarios de estos servicios. El entorno financiero también presenta barreras que en ocasiones responde a sesgos discriminatorios, tanto en las políticas institucionales como en las decisiones que toman los agentes financieros. Algunos resultados importantes en las investigaciones surgidas del Common Sense Lab sugieren que la educación financiera es importante, pero no determinante. Dar información solo por dar información a los usuarios no cambia los comportamientos. El sistema financiero y bancario está diseñado para que las personas más vulnerables económicamente fallen. Y dado que los servicios y recursos ofrecidos no empatan con sus necesidades ni en la forma ni en la periodicidad en la que obtienen sus recursos. Por ello, en materia de ahorro y cumplimientos de pagos, es muy importante la experimentación y el diseño de intervenciones ad hoc, así también como ponderar qué incentivos o barreras funcionan y cuáles no en cada segmento de población. Para que nos expanda estos resultados y sobre todo nos ayude a visibilizar opciones para disminuir los sesgos cognitivos en el ámbito financiero, quiero presentarles a Mariel. Mariel Beasley es directora del Center for Advanced Insights en la Universidad de Duke y cofundadora del Common Sense Lab, un centro comprometido con mejorar el comportamiento financiero de más de 500,000 hogares de ingresos bajos en los Estados Unidos. En esta misma universidad llevó a cabo estudios de maestría en políticas públicas y actualmente es profesora en la maestría de Ciencias del Comportamiento para Políticas Municipales, así como de Behavioral Insights. Utiliza métodos cuantitativos para diseñar y probar rigurosamente las ideas en el campo, explorando lo que se necesita, lo que funciona y cómo avanzar. Para conocer más sobre su trabajo, les pido de favor un aplauso de bienvenida a Mariel Beasley.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn this on. Perfect. And then I'm going to turn that off so you don't pick me up twice. Thank you all so much for having me here. I'm thrilled to spend the next hour or so talking a little bit about our work, some of the things that we've learned, and sort of how that intersects with the things that you guys are talking about around discrimination and injustice and all of those things. So a little bit, I tend to pace while I talk, so I've got the mic so I can stand up and walk. So basically, a little bit thank you for the introduction, as Alexandra already said, but this is our research lab at Duke University. We really focus on how do we use behavioral science to help make people happier, healthier, and wealthier, and that's sort of with these principles of behavioral science. And one of the reasons why we focus on these questions of happier, healthier, and wealthier is because no one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be sick, I want to be poor, and I want to be angry at everyone all the time. And yet, every day, what we're doing is we're making decisions and we're operating in environments that are really kind of driving us down that path. And so behavioral science is actually a really nice, ripe space to be looking here because of something that we refer to as the intention-action gap. And this is the idea that even though we have the best of intentions to be saving money, we have the best of intentions to exercise better, we have the best of intentions to sort of treat other people kindly, the world is set up in such a way that we rarely are able to kind of follow through on those intentions to actions. And so we see behavioral science as a tool both to understand why does this gap exist, why do we see this gap between what people want and what people do and sort of their environment around them, and also how can we help close that gap using behavioral science. So kind of knowing that this was our focus, about 3.5 years ago, with support from MetLife Foundation, we specifically started to focus on sort of the financial life and the financial health and well-being of low-income populations, predominantly in the United States. So apologies, a lot of my examples and work are going to come from the US, but I think what we'll see through this conversation, there are lots of things that are applicable to many cultures, including here in Mexico. So today, Common Sense Lab is supported by both MetLife Foundation and the BlackRock Emergency Savings Initiative. So essentially over the last 3.5 years, what we've done is we've worked with over 50 financial service providers, local governments, fintech companies, universities, anybody who sort of intersects with somebody's financial life. And we've designed over 60 field experiments to try to sort of make changes within sort of that product or service to really help people increase savings, decrease debt, and manage their cash flow better, but really from a provider design space rather than sort of trying to convince the individual to do something different. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So I'm not going to spend too much time getting into the statistics and sort of why did we decide to focus on financial decision making for low to moderate income households and the behavioral science around that, because Alexandra already did a very nice job kind of laying out what is the financial situation of so many people around the world. So a couple of highlights that she mentioned. So even though actually the number of Mexicans with a savings account is increasing, it's actually decreased from 15% to 10% that are actively saving in those accounts at an institution. 5% of, actually less than 5% of Mexicans that actually have a retirement savings account are actively contributing to that retirement savings account, and yet 11% are hoping to retire on their pension alone. So we have sort of this, a little bit of a, so basically a lot of people expect that they won't be able to retire just on their pension, and yet they're still having a hard time saving into and preparing for that retirement. And 57% of Mexicans have some form of debt and sort of kind of trying to manage that credit. And as Alexandra said, a lot of that is department credit cards. And yet actually the majority of this is even in the informal sector. So people are still actually managing debt, but they're doing it in an informal sector where there may be less protections, but also because it's easier for them to operate in many times, in many ways, and it's a little bit more accessible. The statistics in the United States are actually not that different. The personal savings rate of the bottom 90% of the population is 0%. 40% of people who are 5 to 10 years away from retirement have nothing saved for retirement. 7.4 million people are working multiple jobs. I'm trying to turn that off. So 7.4 million people are working multiple jobs to try to make ends meet, but that also means that they're dealing with sort of multiple income flows coming from different places, trying to sort that, figure out where it goes, and how to manage that. 38% of people in the United States have revolving credit card debt, so they have charged up debt on credit cards and are not paying it off. And 1 in 3 in the United States actually has currently debt in collections. So people are... Do you want me to switch to the thing? Okay. If this comes to worse, we'll just unplug it. So basically, what this means is that a lot of people are really struggling. And this is at a time where we have sort of more wealth in the world than ever before. And what we're seeing is sort of increasing inequality, sort of the world over, in many, many countries, the US and Mexico included, where you have people who are doing very, very well, and lots of people who are struggling to get by. And so when we think about how do we help people that are struggling to get by, there's a few challenges that we're facing. And so what I'm going to talk about sort of for this next period of time are what are some of those challenges that are really baked into the system that helps kind of explain why we have these discrepancies, and then what are some opportunities or ways that we can actually kind of address some of those challenges to make movement here. So one thing, this is unsurprising, I think, to folks in this room. The first challenge is that even from the get-go, we have unequal treatment for earnings, expenses, and just access to good financial products. And essentially what this means is that not everybody is starting at the same starting line. A very kind of well-known famous example, this is research from Bertrand and Nathan from 2004, where basically they show that when you have, this is sort of around hiring decisions, that when somebody receives a resume, if it has, this is again in the US, and if it has names that are more associated with sort of white middle-class Americans, that those people are significantly more likely to get a call back for the interview, more likely to get the job, more likely to be earning more than names that are in the United States have more connotations of being people of color. And so, you know, it's basically if you, so right out of the gate, you have people who just are not even able to get the job that they want, the earnings that they want, simply because of the name that they have. And actually 50% less likely to get a call back if you have a name that is not easily associated with white middle-class America. So right out of the gate, people are just set up to be earning less immediately. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. There's tons of examples of this sort of across the literature. And this is really related to this idea of implicit bias. It's not always because the person who's hiring says, oh, I don't want to hire a person of color for this job. It's these very subtle ways that we often don't even realize that we are sort of rushing over and thinking, oh, the skills that this person has isn't the skills that I need in this job. So that's sort of one example at earnings. Now, when we talk about access to financial services, the same implicit bias really plays through and actually gets baked into the way that policies get formed. And essentially what we see is across almost everything, poor people have to pay more for the same or equal services, or for the same or actually worse services in many cases. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about that a lot of people don't even have access to a bank account because they don't have access to the documents that they need to provide to open up that account. In the United States, you have to show proof of citizenship in order to open up an interest-bearing savings account. So if you're undocumented in the United States, you immediately don't even have access to a safe place to store your money where it can grow. Immediately off the bat. This has been baked into the policy. In Mexico, there are similarly strong requirements for opening up bank accounts. And when you think about sort of refugees coming into Mexico, A lot of those folks don't have their documents with them, and now immediately out of the gate, they're denied access to these services. Furthermore, a lot of bank accounts offer free checking or free accounts in the United States under certain requirements. And those requirements are that you have a minimum balance that you're maintaining. So already, people who are living on the margins are less likely to be able to actually have that minimum balance requirement. On top of that, they might be required to have a direct deposit into that account. Direct deposit meaning their employer sends the paycheck straight there. What do we see in the United States? The types of jobs that offer direct deposit and don't offer direct deposit often are divided along economic lines, and that a lot of times people who are sort of lower wage workers and in many cases seasonal workers or other sort of non-traditional work, they actually have a less oftentimes they're not even offered the ability to direct deposit, which means that they can't also use that as a way to get a free checking account. Which means that if they want a checking account, in many cases, they're having to pay monthly fees on that checking account. Furthermore, we know that there are banking deserts, right? There are lots of communities where access to a financial institution is low. And basically what this means is that people have to travel to go to the bank to be able to pull money out, to put money in. And so what they use often to access cash when they need it are ATMs that might be at the local convenience store or elsewhere. All of those also charge additional fees. So now all of a sudden what you have is people who have lower means are charged more just to access financial services that most of us have. And because they're already excluded in many cases from having a bank account, that often means that they resort to informal sort of spaces in order to sort of conduct their financial life. So they might actually go to a Walmart or a large store to cash their checks. Well, there's a fee associated with cashing that check, whereas if they had a bank and a bank account, they could have gone and done that without that fee. Similarly, the access to credit. If they want to actually get a loan through a financial institution, oftentimes they already have to have accounts at that financial institution. They have to be able to show their work history. They have to show a lot of different information. And the lenders that don't require those things, of course, are predatory lenders who are based in low-income communities and really sort of extracting wealth from those communities by charging extremely high interest rates. So now all of a sudden it costs significantly more for somebody who's modest means or low means to just, again, very basic financial services. Access to credit, cashing checks from work, and being able to have a safe place to store that. Furthermore, we also see that they end up having to pay more for daily living expenses. Lots of research shows that the poor actually have to pay more for groceries, even. And this is partly because when you're living on the edges, essentially you have to purchase when you need it, which means you can't wait until something's on sale. You often don't have enough mobility to shop around and see if you can get a better price for something. And rarely can you buy in bulk, which means that, again, it costs more. You're spending more. And then, of course, we know that there's a very strong relationship between health and finances. And so if you're poor, chances are your health expenses are also higher. And so what we see sort of across the board is that people who are low income and of modest means, not only are they less likely to even, and when we think about sort of discrimination in the system, it's very difficult for them to get good paying jobs, and it's very difficult even then to have sort of manageable expenses because their expenses are higher, just sort of as a feature of being poor in the United States. So kind of knowing that the poor just pay more across the board and have a hard time accessing services, and are less likely to be in jobs that have good earnings, we have sort of thought about how could we design or work with an organization to design a solution to at least some of those barriers, right? It's very difficult to change the whole system, very, very difficult. And behavioral science is really about how do we make small changes on the margin to be able to sort of low-cost, easy changes to at least help move the needle a little bit on these questions. So we took a little bit of we spent some time thinking, how could we reduce additional repercussions of bias in earnings? And essentially what I mean is that I talked about it's harder for you to even get a job, but it's also that the wages that you're working at different types of jobs, you might be paid annually in a salary, or you might be paid hourly, right? So these are kind of two different distinctions. Usually if you're paid hourly, it usually means that you're earning lower wages. If you're paid annually in a salary, it usually means that those are sort of higher education levels, higher earnings. So first of all, we said, well, what is just the effects of this? What are just the effects of being paid, even if you actually your amount was the same, the structure of the way this payment is made? What are the effects of getting paid annually in a salary versus paid hourly, even if the actual economic amount is the same? And so we ran a series of experiments. And in some of those conditions, we told people to imagine that they made $35 an hour. Now, that's not a bad salary, actually, in the United States. It's a little bit above the median income. So we said, imagine you make $35 an hour. And we did that for half of them. The other half, we said, imagine you earn $70,000 a year. And we asked them sort of to create their budgets about what they would do. Now, just in case you're not sure, those numbers are actually equivalent. If you're full-time working $35 an hour, your salary, your annualized salary would be $70,000 a year. So we randomized people into one of these earning conditions in a hypothetical scenario, and then we asked them to create their budgets. And what we found is that people who said that they were earning $70,000 a year, who we told that that's what they would be earning, they committed significantly more to savings in their budget than people who are paid on an hourly rate. Economically, it should be the same. We thought, well, maybe it's because people don't know what $35 an hour means, or people don't know what $70,000 a year means in hourly terms. So then we ran the experiment again with a different group of folks, and half of them, we said, imagine you earn $35 an hour. That is $70,000 a year. Imagine that you, and then for the other group, imagine that you earn $70,000 a year. That is $35 an hour. And now we ask them again to create their budgets, and again, we actually still see the same difference. People who are told originally first that they are earning $70,000 a year are willing to save more than the folks who are at the hourly. And then we played with all kinds of things. We said, well, maybe it's about job security. They feel like if they're working on an hourly term, maybe they're just concerned that they're going to lose their job sooner, so they don't want to put money into far off into the future. They feel like they need to use it now. And so then we actually sort of played around with telling them that they were guaranteed a job for 5 years versus they could lose their job at any time. And again, we found that same difference sustained. Now, the thought here, and sort of our hypothesis about why this is because when you frame somebody as earning X amount per year, you are automatically drawing them into a long-term mindset. When you tell somebody that they're earning this much per hour, you are automatically drawing them into a short-term mindset. And short-term mindset is very difficult to save if you have a short-term mindset. So one thing of note, just right off the bat, is that if you have a system where lower wage workers are significantly more likely to be getting jobs that are hourly, that are paid hourly, off the bat you are already making it psychologically more difficult for them to build savings. Even if you were giving them the exact same salary, but framing it in a longer term framework. We did sort of just savings, and then we also specifically did retirement. And what we found is that the effects were much worse for retirement, meaning that, again, if you were paid hourly, you basically didn't want to save anything for retirement because you were so focused on the short term and right in front of you. And just the framing of wages put you into that mindset. So then we actually we said, great, this is really interesting learnings from the lab, but we wanted to do it in a field test. So we worked with gig workers or contract workers. These are 1099 employees in the United States, which means that their income varies a lot. They get paid by the gig rather than sort of by the work that they've done for somebody, rather than the longer term, they're not paid regularly necessarily. And we said, well, there's no reason that we couldn't project out their earnings into a longer time frame than just this is what you've earned on average per job that you've had. And that's traditionally the way that their earnings are reported back to them through this platform that's called Payable in the United States. And so traditionally they're just told, great, this is how much you're making on average per job. So we worked with them to redesign and say, if you continue working at this rate, this is how much you'll make in a year. So again, these are actual people. We framed their earnings as this is how much you're getting per job, this is that hourly frame, versus this is how much you're getting in a year. And then we actually asked them if they wanted to start saving for retirement. And what we found is that when people were in that sort of short-term mindset, only about 43% said, yes, actually, I want to set some of mine aside for savings. And yet when it was in this annualized frame, this sort of longer term, now all of a sudden that was 56% that wanted to actually save for something. So very simple reframing of, even though we couldn't change the way that people got paid, we couldn't change the frequency of how these contract workers got paid, but we were able to change the way that was framed in order to draw people into that longer mindset and actually help build some of that savings. So that's one thing we did around how could you actually sort of combat some of the longer repercussions of bias around earnings. The second question we said is, well, how could we help people refinance into more affordable credit? So one thing we know, as mentioned, that there's very high payday lenders in low-income communities. People often resort to what is easiest or closest nearby. And so what you see is a lot of low-income households taking out these payday loans because they have an immediate need that has to be met. And so they're borrowing at very, very high rates. And when we talk about very, very high rates, we're talking about they can range, over 100% in APR, annualized interest rate, and it can go all the way up to 700%. So very, very high, that people are basically having to pay over and over and over again. They pay 5 times the principal in some cases before they actually pay off that short-term small dollar loan. So a lot of credit unions have really tried to create a product that's an alternative. And it's also a short-term small dollar loan, but the interest rate is much lower. The problem is, once somebody has taken out one payday loan, it's actually very difficult to intercede because we naturally follow our own sort of prior behavior. We call this self-herding. So once somebody has done something once, now they're much more likely to do that same thing again, which means it's very difficult for credit unions to actually interject and get people to actually, instead of taking out the payday loan again, to go to a more affordable credit provider. So we worked with a credit union in Texas. Texas has very, very high payday interest loans. And so we worked with a credit union called Credit Human. And Credit Human, they have this short-term loan at a much more affordable rate. I want to say that it's less than 20% interest rate compared to that, several 100% that the payday lenders offer. However, they've had this product for a little while, not incredibly long, but for a little while, and they know that their members are taking out payday loans because they can actually see in the transactions that there are payments coming out of their bank accounts and going to these payday lenders. So they know that they have members that could benefit from this cheaper product, and yet they're having not the take-up that they would expect, knowing that this is just a significantly better product for them. So we worked with them to target specifically the people who had taken out a payday loan once, because the research also shows that once you've taken out once you've taken out one in a year, the average is now you're going to take out about 8 in that same year. So because they sort of feed into each other, it's a very predatory product. And so essentially what we did is we said, well, let's actually just make it a little bit more salient, the costs, because payday lenders have done a very, very good job of obscuring the cost of a payday loan. And because they're sort of preying upon low-income communities, what happens is that people don't have the time, attention, and energy to actually figure out the math about how much this is actually going to cost them. So what we did is we just actually sent, we identified specifically the people who had taken out a payday loan within the last 3 months and sent them a mailer and an email. And they got the same mailer and email, the same content. And in one group, we sort of gave them a lump sum. This is the total amount that it's going to cost on a payday loan compared to a Credit Human loan. So just trying to make it really, really clear that this is a much cheaper product and make those costs much more salient for folks. So we did that for half of them. For the other half, instead of this lump sum payment of the total amount, we actually gave them a daily comparison. And we said, every day, this is how much it costs you. Now, the reason for this, now a lot of people intuitively say, but saying that it cost me $223 more feels more motivating than saying it costs me $3.70 a day more, right? It feels differently, even though actually based on the common length of a loan, those numbers are actually equivalent. And yet what we found is different people reacted differently to which message they received. And essentially what we found is that people who opened emails liked the lump sum. So if they opened emails, they actually liked the lump sum. They found that more motivating, and they were more likely to then actually apply for this credit product as opposed to a payday loan in the next cycle. However, the people who did not open their emails, so these are the people who just received the postcard at home, they actually liked the daily much better. So this is a little bit interesting. Any ideas why we would see this difference? No guesses? Well, one thing is people who, a guess in the back? Yeah, so everybody got both the postcards and the emails. But I think our hypothesis here is that people who open their email are different than people who don't, right? And our hunch is that people who open their email probably work desk jobs. They probably work in an office. They're probably a little bit higher earners. And because they're on their computer and able to access that email. People who don't open email, they probably set up an account once, and they don't actually they probably don't work at a desk. They probably don't actually use it, exactly. And so the idea is that these are probably actually two very different types of people. They have probably two very different types of job, different levels of education, etc. We couldn't look at that, but this sort of corresponds with other research that we had done in the lab that showed that people who have lower self-control like the daily, they like the daily because it pulls people into feeling the need to do something today about it. Whereas when it's in the lump sum, they say, the lump sum is still going to be there if I don't take action on this until next week, or if I don't take action on this until later. But when it's framed into a daily, that is particularly appealing for people who have a little bit lower self-control. And we do see, there's other studies out there that show that lower levels of self-control also correlate with a higher likelihood of going to college, or higher levels of self-control correlate with higher likelihood to go to college, et cetera, et cetera. But this is basically saying, let's use this idea that people have sort of an immediate, sort of a focus on the immediate present, and by framing costs into that immediate present, can actually be more impactful to get them to move into cheaper products. So the last example I'm going to give just on this piece about bias is how do we reduce bias for judges setting bail? I know that last month you had a great speaker who came and talked about sort of bias within the judicial system and sort of implicit with bias with judges and things like that. This happens a lot in the United States. It's incredible. I'm sure he shared a lot of the studies and the statistics around it. But one thing that happens a lot in the United States is around setting bail. So basically setting bail means that the first time you appear before a judge, basically they choose how much you have to pay in order to get out of jail until your court date, until it's actually decided if you're guilty or not. By law, judges are required to consider ability to pay. By law. And this is because we don't want to have a pauper's prison, right? We don't want to be imprisoning people just because they're poor. And yet when you look at the US justice system, we sort of see this over and over and over again, that we have incredibly sort of overrepresentation of low income, people of color, in the court system, and you have an incredible overrepresentation of folks who are sitting in jail waiting for their court date simply because they don't have the money to post bail. And you also see in a lot of these communities that wealth is getting stripped out of these communities. And the reason is because a judge will set bail for $5,000, that the family has to come up with $5,000 for, and in many cases it's not a violent crime. It's, for nonviolent crimes, but the family has to come up with $5,000. They, in many cases, don't have access to that. We know in the United States, 41% of households in the US, across income levels, would have to borrow or sell something to cover a $400 expense. So to ask a low-income household to come up with $5,000 just to post bail is crazy. And what you see is that judges are incredibly anchored on sort of these round numbers that they have sort of just used in the past, and they don't actually, there's very little evidence they're actually doing any type of consideration of ability to pay. They just sort of have it in their head that, oh, bail should be at $5,000. Bail should be at $10,000. And these numbers are actually fairly arbitrary within the system. So we are actually currently running a project in New York City where we are essentially in the moment that judges are thinking about setting bail, that in the docket we have created an ability to pay worksheet that essentially is the very first thing that judge will anchor on when they're setting bail. And so we don't expect them to actually set what we tell people are able to pay, because most people are able to pay that are coming through the New York City court system are like under $100, right? I mean, they have very little cash disposable. But we're looking at, can we get people to actually, in that moment, anchor on something else to slow down that process of just automatically taking the number that is top of mind. So we don't have results yet. I'll let you know when we do. So we're still finding out. So one of that first challenge is just like we have all these sort of biases in the system that have set people up to fail because they're already earning less, their costs are already higher, and most of the credit products that are available are incredibly expensive. And so that's sort of just inherent into the system that low-income folks have to deal with. The second challenge is that risk and responsibility over time has shifted more and more to the individual. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about, for retirement, for example, it used to be that most employers had a pension. And if you worked for the employer long enough, you would be taken care of in retirement. And yet, more and more of these policies have shifted from a defined benefits plan that basically says you work long enough and this is what you're going to get every month of the rest of your life, this pension. It's now shifted into a defined contributions plan that says, well, we're going to allow you to put money into an account all of your working years. Whatever the market does with it, the market does with it. And then that's what you'll use to retire on. Good luck in managing it. And what we see again, right, as I mentioned earlier, in the United States, 40% of people who are 5 to 10 years away have nothing saved. So we've really shifted that responsibility to the individual. And one of the reasons that we've done that, or sort of the case for that from a behavioral science perspective, is likely around this idea of fundamental attribution error. Is anybody familiar with this term? The L got a little bit shifted down in formatting. So basically it means that we're actually very bad at understanding what drives behavior and decisions. And our natural inclination is to assume that when we do good things, it's because of the person we are. When we do bad things, it's because of the environment we're operating in. When other people do good things, it might be because of the type of person they are, but it also might be luck, it might be, environment. But when other people do bad things, it's entirely because of the person that they are. So a really nice example of this, well, an example in the US, is if you're meeting a friend for coffee or for dinner, and say you are 30 minutes late to dinner. Why? Because you ran into traffic. Because you had a last-minute email that popped up at work. Because your kids were screaming and you couldn't get out the door. All of these things that have absolutely no reflection on the type of person you are. These are things that happen in the environment as an individual. But if your friend is 30 minutes late meeting you for dinner, it's because she's disrespectful, she doesn't care about time, she just never pays attention to those things, she doesn't care that she's wasting my time. And we can't help but blame sort of the character of the individual when somebody else is doing something that we think is not right or bad, which means that it's actually very difficult to empathize with other people. And so we've sort of shifted this sort of risk and responsibility to the individual because we say, if people are poor, it's because they're making bad decisions. If people are poor, it's because they don't care enough. If people are unhealthy, it's because they don't care. They should go to college if they want to, get a better job. They should open up a savings account and start saving if they want to have enough for retirement. It's that shift to the individual because we assume that when bad things happen to individuals, it's a reflection of their character. And this is really kind of part of this stems from this idea of sort of classic economics, which sort of assumes that people are hyper-rational, and that essentially if you want to convince somebody to do something, all they have to do is they just accumulate information, they're going to account for probabilities, they're able to sort of project out into the future, and always act in a way for their own well-being, right? And this is sort of the standard way that classic economics has viewed people. And this means that we really assume that people are making a decision in a bubble, in a vacuum. So somebody says, I think I'll skip my appointment. And we say, oh, it's because they don't care. They're not going to their doctor's appointment because this isn't important to them. And so what we do, naturally, if we care about people going to the doctor and we say this is terrible that people aren't going to the doctor, we try to give them information about why they should go to the doctor, right? We tell them this is what you should do. We tell them the benefits of look, it could be bad if you don't do this. And we project out probabilities of this is how bad it would be if you didn't do this, and there's a risk that this really bad things would happen to you. Because we assume that people are making a decision sort of in isolation, and all they need is better information to make a better decision. And we do this in the financial world as well. Essentially what we do is if people aren't making good financial decisions, we shift that risk and responsibility to the individual and say, it's simply because you don't know enough. It's simply because you haven't figured out how to manage your money. So here's 1 million different financial education courses, financial literacy courses, to help you learn how to do it better, because you're ultimately responsible. And actually in the US, in the last 30 years, there's just been a huge expansion on the work on financial education, and sort of in the early 2000s, the Financial Literacy and Education Commission was established to really focus on creating sort of a national priority around financial education, because again, it assumes that the responsibility is on the individual and they just need to know how to make better choices. And in the US, about $600 million a year is spent on financial education. And of course, we should be asking, does it work? That's a very expensive price tag, and yet we still have a lot of the portion of the population that's not doing particularly well financially. Luckily, there are researchers, Fernandez and Lynch out of Boulder, who did a meta-analysis on every study on financial education that they could find that had been published. And essentially what they found is that financial education, this content-based financial education, accounts for 0.1% of the actual variation in financial behavior. So not zero, but very, very close. Now, this, and actually it's even lower, hard to believe it could go lower, but it's even lower for people who are low socioeconomic status. And why is that? It's not because they can't learn. It's because they're already coming in with lower earnings. They're already coming in with less access to good products. They're already coming in with higher expenses across the board. And so, of course, just telling them what compound interest is isn't going to help. So this is one of the big things. Over and over and over again, behavioral science shows that knowing information doesn't lead to behavior change. Knowing what you should or shouldn't do doesn't actually lead to behavior change, because what influences somebody arriving late to dinner is not because they're a terrible person. It's because their environment is set up in such a way that it's hard for them to get someplace on time. Imagine moving the meeting to a place closer to where they were going to be. Now much more likely that they'd be able to make it on time. Imagine, sending a message an hour before dinner saying, "Are we still on? I'm getting ready to leave my house." Much more likely that they're going to show up on time. And so essentially, knowing information alone doesn't change behavior, but it's our environment that shapes our behavior and our choices much more than information alone. And so when we think back on that person who's deciding to skip their appointment and making this decision in a vacuum, and we imagine that they're just sitting there just by themselves thinking about this, the truth is their life probably looks a little bit more like this. It's no wonder that it's hard for us to follow through on things when everywhere we go, other people, other institutions are asking for our time, attention, and money. And it is only worse if you have modest means, because now you have even less of that time, attention, and money to provide. So kind of knowing this, the very first thing that people say in trying to sort of encourage better financial behavior, of course, is, well, the first thing you need to do is create a budget. You have to sort of figure out your inflows and outflows, and anybody who's looking for sort of help financially, that is generally the very first thing that they're told, that the advice that they receive is make a budget. So knowing that budgets are actually about information, right? So this is Mint. Has anybody here used Mint? Familiar with Mint? So it's a product where you can sync your bank accounts and your credit cards and everything like that, and then it categorizes all of your expenses that you've had and sort of shows them back to you. It's just become a prettier way to show information. A pretty pie chart that, again, is just information, not terribly helpful in actually getting people to figure out how to actually manage that. So this was an opportunity where we said, how could we actually help people, particularly folks who are on very restricted budgets, manage that cash flow a little bit better, knowing what we know about that's not just providing information to people. How could sort of the people who are designing the system be a little bit more accountable in creating a better version for people to operate through? And so we thought, how could we redesign budgeting? And so the first thing that we did is we said, well, a budget, while it provides information, the other thing that it does is it provides an anchor. An anchor is sort of that number that you first get attached to, that then you sort of adjust to. And the reason why this is important is because if I asked all of you to sit down and create a budget, and I asked you to decide how much you are going to spend on groceries for the following month, you're going to give me a single number, and that is now your anchor for that month. The problem with that, and this is anchoring, the problem, again, the G is a little bit off, but the problem with this, of course, is that nobody is going grocery shopping once a month. And so having a single anchor at the beginning of the month that is your total amount is actually probably not helpful to people. Particularly not helpful for people who are needing to figure out how to stretch that budget to the end of the month. And a good way to kind of also think about this is that on the day you get paid, you feel rich. The day that check hits your account, you're like, yeah, we're getting wine with dinner, we're going out. When you get to the end of the month, now all of a sudden, it's like, well, what do we have in the cupboards? Because now all of a sudden you feel poor. A budget is basically set up to remind you at the beginning of the month how rich you are, and does very little to help you figure out how to get to the end. And so what we wanted to do was create a more meaningful anchor for people to actually get them through the month. So that when you go in the first time you're grocery shopping after you have created your budget, you're not saying, great, I have $200 to spend on food. Because you don't have $200 to spend on food. You have $50 that week to spend on food, because you're going to need $50 next week and $50 the week after that and $50 the week after that. So we worked with a company called Propel. Propel is a tech company in the United States that really focuses on, basically they created an app for people who receive government transfers for food spending. So this is very low income households. And basically the idea, so you get a card that you get to use just like a debit card. But what happens is that for most people, it's actually very difficult to know how much money you have left on that card after you've spent it. And so what they found, what this fintech company found, you can call a number on the back, like you can call a phone number, but people hate making phone calls these days. And so very few people would do that. The other way they could figure out their balance is that they could go into a nearby store, make a small food purchase, and then on the receipt it would tell them how much they had left. And so basically this company found that a lot of people who are already on very restricted food budgets were going to convenience stores, because those are the closest, even though, again, the prices are very, very high as compared to a grocery store, buying small things at the convenience store in order to check their balance. So they created an app that basically allowed people for free, just like you would with a banking app, check your balance and see your expenses. But when we first worked with them, we looked at their data. And essentially what we found is that these beneficiaries, this benefit is dispersed once a month. They get one deposit. And what they found is that people were rapidly spending down at the very beginning of that month. Very similar to how you see the same with paychecks. People's spending accelerates right after they get paid. It's the same thing with these disbursements. And so when you look at a budget line, this is for food. This is something that you need every day throughout the month. And maybe, we say the ideal is a straight line. It's probably not actually a straight line, because you probably actually do want to do a little bit of bulk shopping in the beginning of the month. But it would it wouldn't be so much that you would be running out early on. But the actual spending we found is that people spent 80% of their month's budget in the first 9 days of the month. And this is a problem, because what happens, there's other studies that show that actually kids whose families receive this benefit, the further they are away from that day of disbursement, the worse they do on standardized tests in school. So these aren't that families are spending soon because they're spending first out of the card and then they're spending their own money the rest of the month. These are households that are running out of food for their kids, and then their kids are not, they're sending their kids to school hungry, which then makes them performing worse in school, which then leads to worse grades, which then makes it less likely that they're going to want to continue in school. And it's this sort of very, very vicious cycle. So we worked with them where essentially in one condition, the one with the blue bar around it, we said, let's just take their total amount of benefits and divide it by 4. We can't change the way the policy is actually implemented, certainly not in a short-term frame. We can't change it so that they actually do 4 disbursements. But what we can do is change the digital display. And so that's what we did. We said, let's just take the total amount, divide it by 4, and get that to be the anchor that people spend on. And versus the general condition that just tells them how much they have in their balance. And notice they say when you'll get your next disbursement, right? So the one on the right says, $16.79 is how much you have left. Your next disbursement will be coming October 3rd. Now, that's 10 days away, and they have $16 left to make it the next 10 days. That's likely tough. And what we found is that when we did this is actually throughout the entire month, they kept a larger proportion in their their spend was much slower for the rest of the month. And ultimately, it resulted in stretching their benefits by 2 additional days, which 2 additional days maybe doesn't sound like that much. but we're talking about 6 additional meals for a family, and without making any really substantive changes to policy, but hopefully providing a little bit more evidence that perhaps that might be a change of policy that might want to come down the line. So the third, and kind of, I know we're running close on time, so the third challenge, we're okay, oh good. So the third challenge, and Alexandra mentioned this as well, the third challenge is that financial products are designed for the people who design financial products. And this is really kind of this cognitive bias that's this fact that we're all extremely egocentric. As much as we would like to sort of empathize with others and think about others, we all naturally have a filter that we see the world through. And that means that it's very difficult for us to design for somebody who has an experience that's very different than our own. And so this is the idea, is like we assume that our experiences and what works for us works for others. And we just don't even think outside of that. And there's lots of examples where we see this. We see this in lawmaking. Again, an example from the United States. There are necessities in the United States that lots of states have sort of a, they don't require taxes on like necessary items. And this is basically trying to sort of reduce the tax burden of low-income households, right? So basically they say, great, we're not going to tax food, we're not going to tax some other sort of things that we think of necessities, and we're only going to tax sort of other things that you could choose to go without. A few years ago in the United States, this was sort of big news because somebody actually looked at what are all the things that are exempt from taxes and what are the things that are included in taxes on this idea of what's necessary and what's not necessary. And of course, one of the things that gets taxed are feminine hygiene products as sort of a non-necessity. Now, clearly this is because the vast majority of lawmakers in the United States are men. And if there had been women involved in that decision, they would probably have said, no, these are necessities in sort of a monthly budget. But this is sort of an example of how we can't help but design and think about the world through our own perspective, which is all the more reason why it's really important to have diverse groups and voices in any time there's designing of policies and laws and rules and such. Because when we're designing for ourselves, a lot of us naturally, inherently understand that we're not these hyper-rational beings. We design this hyper-rational space for other people, but for ourselves, we design better solutions. And this is because we sort of have this innate understanding that real people, ourselves in the world, that we have sort of, we're hyper-focused on the present. We have sort of immediate needs and wants. We value things we can touch and feel. We fail to think about trade-offs. We don't understand probability. And there's actually tons of research to suggest that this is how most people in the world operate. And so a lot of people, when they think about their own life, they do a pretty good job designing for these things. Think about how many of you have how many of you have eaten fruits and vegetables at home in the last 3 days? Whoa, not as many people. Oh, okay, of you. I was like, wow, not very many people. So what's your strategy? What's your strategy for doing it? So, any thoughts? How many of you have fruits and vegetables on your countertop? A couple of you, okay. How many of you sort of have have a significant other that sort of reminds you to have fruits and vegetables? How many people, we sort of create these systems for ourselves, and research shows that actually if you put fruits and vegetables on your counter, you're much more likely to eat them. How many of you have a grocery shopping list where you say, I always buy these things so that I always have them at home? Again, it's a strategy that you're using, knowing that in the moment you might be tempted to eat something else. And now you've created a habit around it. Another example is exercise, right? going to exercise. This is something most people wish they did more of. Very few people do. But when we design the people who are effective at actually getting up and going to the gym and exercising, most cases it's because they've designed an environment that helps them do that. They go to bed with their running shoes right by the bed. I think Kim Kardashian sleeps in her workout clothes so that she can just get up and go. People have a gym buddy that they text with to say, oh, we're gonna go exercise today. They have a route that they always take. They get a dog to force them to go on walks. We're very good at designing environments for ourselves. We have a lot harder time designing for other people because we forget about all of the little tricks that we're using for ourselves. And it's the same thing for financial services. And we're going to talk about that. And so it's the same principle that the environment shapes our behavior choices more than information alone. The problem is that we really only understand our own environment. We don't understand other people's environment to design for them. So, does anybody know what's the most effective savings product in the United States? Little trick there, United States. Any ideas? The most effective savings product in the United States is the 401k retirement savings product. So the 401k is basically is basically it's through your employer, and they take a portion of your paycheck and send it into a retirement product. So here's two companies, and when I say two companies, this is actually averages of multiple companies. But for a group of them, the average is about a 47% participation rate in this program. For the other company, it's 93%. What is the difference between these two companies? Any guesses? Oh, like the match? You're thinking like the amount that the employer is willing to contribute for them? Good guess? Very close, yes. So it's not that it's, yeah, so it's not to say that it's forced, but they've changed the way that it's, in the ones that's only 47%, you have to opt in to participate. You have to fill out the forms, you have to choose your allocations, you have to do all of these things, and then you're saving. For the one where the average participation rate is 93%, this is where they've actually said, you're defaulted in, you now have to opt out. You have to fill out forms if you don't want to be saving into this account. And what you see is huge differences in savings rates. Interestingly enough, we still see the same differences for low-wage workers that have access to this product, right? So if it's an opt-in, we're only seeing actually 18% of people who are earning less than $30,000 a year. If it's an opt-out, now all of a sudden we're up to 88% that are participating and contributing. That's a huge difference. And more companies are moving into the group on the group of companies that are in the 93 and 88%, which is wonderful. We're going to really make a huge dent on retirement savings. The problem is it's tens of millions of working Americans that don't have access to this product. It's a wonderful product if you work for an employer that offers it, that has designed it as an opt-out. So if you happen to be lucky and work at one of those companies, you're made in the shade. If you work at the other company, it's really an uphill battle. And this is if you're working at a company that even offers it. And as mentioned, a lot of lower wage workers don't even have access to this. Because if you're an hourly worker at McDonald's, unlikely that you have that opportunity. Now, one of the reasons why this is so effective is because of defaults, right? So the people who created this product, they had an employer, they had they had the ability to be able to transfer money right out of a paycheck into savings. And so they were able to design this product that's very, very effective for the people that have access to it. So how do we design better short-term savings products for more people? How could we actually do that? So if you think about short-term savings, the features of the long-term savings is that it comes straight out of your paycheck. It's automatic, it's easy. For short-term savings, essentially you have to log into your account. It's a lot of friction on the upfront. So you already have to have a bank account. You have to log in to it, and it's sort of, I don't even think you can do this at a branch. You have to actually have access to a computer to be able to do this. You can choose the frequency that you want to get paid, but you still have to have some sort of a cadence to know when you're going to have money in that account. You have to choose a set amount that you're comfortable saving, and that's sort of how you have to set this up. This is a fine short-term savings solution for people who have time, have access to the internet, have initiative, and have actually a pretty consistent timing of income and a predictable size of income, because they can actually use this product. However, 57.3 million people in the United States are freelancers, which means that they actually cannot predict the timing of their income, and they cannot predict the size of their income in a consistent, ongoing, automatic way. This product is not built for them. They are now actually excluded from being able to save in the easiest and best products that we have for savings. We estimate the number of people that are doing freelance jobs to only grow, which means we're actually increasing the percent of users who don't have access to this. So if we were to redesign savings, and we have in a couple of places, the first thing is that we'd reduce friction costs. It's just a ton of friction to do anything, and it requires a lot of time and effort for people. And as I mentioned, people don't have that, and if you're low income, you have even less of it, because everything takes more time, everything costs more, that it's all the more important that friction in the system to access to good products is reduced. The other thing that we would do is we'd leverage mental accounting. Mental accounting is this idea that we naturally categorize and spend money differently depending on where it's coming from and where it's going. So your paycheck, you already sort of mentally in your head think about that in the cadence of your life expenses. And so mental accounting is sort of the saying, but let's figure out when that money is not accounted for already someplace else and direct it into savings. So that's a good way for people who are really kind of living paycheck to paycheck, is to help figure out when are there sort of income bumps or streams that we can help redirect into savings. And then the last thing that we would do is we'd also think about how can we get people to pre-commit to good behavior. And this is sort of a standard thing for most people, is that today is never the day to start. We always want to start the diet. We always want to start the exercise plan. We always want to start our productivity plan next week, next month. We never want to do it today. And this is the idea, is because our future self's not tempted yet. There's a wonderful study looking at Netflix movie selections. And if you ask people to pick the movies that they want to watch tonight, it's like The Hangover, Wedding Crashers, like pretty low-brow comedy, mindless movies. If you ask people what movies they want to watch next week or next month, it's like documentaries, it's like really like moving art flicks. And so we're really optimistic about our future self, but our current self, less so. So we worked with a company called Digit. And Digit does sort of this passive savings, SMS-based passive savings in the back. And essentially, we worked with Digit to figure out one of the biggest paychecks, or checks, not a paycheck, one of the biggest flows of income that a household in the United States receives is a tax refund. So we have, in the US, we pay into the tax system out of our paychecks. And then at the end of the year, many households get money back because they've overpaid, or they get certain tax credits that are built in the system to sort of help lift people out of poverty. So for many households, it's the largest check they receive all year. It's bigger than any paycheck they'll get. And so we said, well, what if we could actually get people to choose to save part of this? Because they might not have actually, it's money that might not quite yet be accounted for something else. So for Digit was able to actually see in their accounts when that deposit got made. And so they sent them a text message that said, hi, Mariel, you got a tax refund this year. What % would you like to save? Notice it doesn't say, do you want to save? So it already sort of implies that you're going to be saving something. What % would you like to save? So that's what we did for one group. For the other group, we actually sent it very early in tax season before they would get their refund. And this time we said, hi, Mariel, you might get a federal tax refund this year, because we didn't know if they would get one or not. If you do get one, what % would you like to save? So raise your hand if you think more people saved when they got the text message when their refund was in hand. Raise your hand if you think people were more likely to save then. A couple people? A couple people? This is a nice example of social proof. As soon as people see some people's hands go up, they're looking around and they say, oh, other people think this is a good idea. This must be right. Okay, so what if you think, raise your hand if you think that it was that more people wanted to save when they were asked before they even knew that they would get a refund. Okay, some. The truth is everyone is right on that one, because about 10% of people in both conditions wanted to save something. So there weren't more people that wanted to save in one than the other. The big difference was in how much people were willing to save. And essentially what we found is that when people were asked when the money was in hand, they wanted to save, on average, 17% of their tax refund, which is actually quite a bit, because these checks are quite large. So when they were asked when their refund was in hand and it already had hit their account, what % would they like to save? They said, on average, 17%. But when they were asked and committed to it before they were tempted, before they even knew if they were going to get a refund, before they even started thinking about the things that they were going to do with that money, now they were willing to save 27% of that refund. And so a huge difference in just getting people to sort of pre-commit ahead of time. And we should be asking, of course, well, what happened the day after their tax refund? The nice thing is that Digit could actually move that money. So people could pre-commit, they could move it, but they made it very easy to get the money back. They made it very easy to say that people could just text and say, move it back into my checking. And yet, we still found that 3 months later, 80% of the savings was still in the account. So it was nice, it was sticky. Okay, the very last thing I told you that was going to be my last thing. The very last thing that I think is really, really important when we think about financial decisions and vulnerable populations and sort of the barriers to access, but also just the way that we've designed systems for people to operate in, is that this is probably one of the biggest challenges that's really overarching, is that people who are operating under scarcity or with scarce resources are the least able to devote time, energy, or attention to doing something. And yet we repeatedly make them jump through more hoops. When you think about what does it take to get benefits from the government around, getting, like Prospera, getting cash assistance, there's a lot of paperwork that has to get filled out. There's just a lot of time that's needed to apply for these benefits. Imagine that somebody is looking for financial assistance to go to college. It's a huge amount of time and effort that goes into that. You have a lot of paperwork that you have to fill out in the United States. And people who are operating under scarce resources are the least equipped to do that. And this is this concept of scarcity. And the idea here is that when resources are tight, this adds this cognitive tax on somebody's bandwidth, and it actually really reduces their ability to exert self-control. And one of the ways to think about this is that every decision we make is like lifting a weight. And it's not that we're getting stronger by doing it. It's that you can only lift a weight for so long before your arm gives out. And you can no longer now all of a sudden you can no longer take the time and energy necessary to make a good decision. And the difference with scarcity, so everybody's lifting the weight every time they make a decision, but if you have slack in your budget, you're lifting a 1 pound weight because the consequences aren't big. If you make the wrong choice, the consequences aren't very large. You're still going to have food on the table for dinner tonight. But when you are operating under scarcity, it is every decision you make is like lifting a 25 pound weight. It's significantly harder. You get worn out significantly faster. And it's because every decision you make is consequential. You're deciding whether you're going to pay to ride the bus or have money to fulfill your prescriptions. So these decisions are incredibly tough. And Mulanathan, Shafir, and Mani have done a couple of studies on this that really show that when people are operating under scarcity, it actually has a dramatic impact on your IQ. And this isn't to say that people are dumb. It's literally saying that the effect of being poor taxes your cognitive reasoning. And the way that they looked at this study is they went to India and they looked at farmers who basically right before the harvest are very poor. They've got no money because they basically only get paid once a year. And right before the harvest, they are under extreme scarcity. Right after the harvest, they're in abundance, right? That is when they're feeling flush. So they took these same groups of farmers and they gave them IQ tests and a couple of other sort of cognitive control tasks before the harvest and after the harvest. And the difference was about 13 IQ points for the same people. That equivalency, that 13 IQ points, is the same as operating as if you had not slept at all the night before. So imagine going through life having never slept, because every day is as if you had not slept at all the night before. And so when we're talking about trying to design better programs and services for low-income households, that's really what we're designing for, is people who haven't slept. And so how do we make sure that what we're designing is easy, accessible, fair, and sort of really kind of helps reduce that cognitive tax and effort. And we've done some things where if you just send text messages to help remind people about where they're at in a process, it increases their completion rates of actually finishing those applications. So very small things can help reduce this. So
Okay.
That's it.
Very good, Maria. Thank you very much.
No problem.
¿Nos ayudan con el micrófono? Bueno. Ya. Muchas gracias, Mariel. Voy a hablar en español. Muchas gracias. Creo que fue una excelente presentación y además creo que nos da como muchos elementos también nuevas formas de entender los sesgos, ¿no? O sea, diferentes a lo que estuvimos viendo en la conferencia anterior, lo cual me parece que es fascinante. Y sobre todo también, digamos, como en un ámbito, ¿no?, que apareciera que a veces es muy técnico, ¿no? Pues en efecto, digamos, tenemos todos estos elementos que nos están generando mayores niveles de desigualdad también para poblaciones de por sí ya muy vulnerables, ¿no? Entonces, me parece que fue una exposición fascinante que nos da muchos elementos y que estoy segura que nuestros participantes el día de hoy van a estar muy interesados en hacer algunas cuantas preguntas adicionales. Entonces, bueno, me gustaría abrir el espacio para escuchar inquietudes, observaciones, preguntas también, comentarios, si quieren también casos específicos que quieran traer a la mesa, creo que sería muy interesante escuchar sus reflexiones. ¿Alguien quisiera participar? Creo que ya tenemos por ahí un par de manos. social pressure.
I know. As mentioned, it's weird to hear it in Spanish in my ear. As mentioned, I teach a class at Duke on this, and I'm quite good at sitting awkwardly until class participation happens. So
it's a good tactic.
Yeah.
Gracias por su presentación. Yo tengo una pregunta. A ver, me gusta mucho este enfoque de dejar a un lado el individualismo y adoptar un enfoque ecológico, ¿no? Pero eso requiere un cambio estructural en el que tienen que entrar en juego diferentes actores, públicos, privados y diferentes intereses. No sé si nos puede platicar un poco de su experiencia con respecto a la interacción con cómo hacer. Deben ser políticas públicas a final de cuentas, porque parece que las intervenciones son limitadas y quien debería tener ese poder de intervención pues es el Estado, ¿no?
Yeah, I think that's a great. Take that off. Well, it's in Spanish. I think that's a great point and a great question, and it's not easy. It's one of those things where if it were easy, people would have done it already. And I think that the role of this is me speaking as Mariel, not as Common Sense Lab, not as Duke University. I think that the role of government is incredibly crucial as we think about how do we better design programs and systems for citizens that is back to this sort of actual protections that the state can do rather than this sort of increasing shift. And I think from our perspective, it's really emphasizing to people across income levels, across disciplines, sort of ways that they can recognize in themselves how, like, they're incredible beneficiaries of a system that's built to work for them. And how do we make sure that we're increasing representation in government to create these better systems for people who sort of have different environments that they're operating in? And I don't know how to do it at this point. I think there is some, I can't remember the author on it now, but it's actually some legal theory around how choice, we have such a narrative around choice that we've actually used that as a new outgroup, and that we've used choice as a justification for discrimination. And it used to be we used religion as a way to, and in some cases we still do, right? But it used to be sort of that was baked in, and the reason why we could sort of treat other people poorly or not do good things for them was because of basically because they weren't of our religion, they weren't children of God, they were other. We then also had a time where it was about civilization, and we could sort of treat other people inhumanely and discriminate against them because we said, well, they're savages, they're not civilized, they're not, and that basically choice has become this new divider, because we can say it's this focus and emphasis on the individual, where we can say it's not our fault that this system doesn't work for them. It's the choices that they're making every day. My hope is that in the same way that we've sort of come a long way on, discrimination around language and religion and gender, and even though we haven't solved those things, that we'll also be able to sort of increase the consciousness around that choice is sort of this false differentiator. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yo tengo dos preguntas. La primera es, ¿cuál es el costo para un país si no se incluye a las personas vulnerables en los sistemas financieros? Y la segunda, me cuesta mucho trabajo pensar que incluir a los grupos vulnerables en las cuestiones financieras traiga ganancias para esos grupos vulnerables más que para las empresas, sobre todo en un país como México, cuyos bancos tienen o cobran o tienen los intereses más altos y están pensando sobre todo más en beneficiarse a sí mismos como empresas más que a la sociedad en su conjunto.
Yeah. I think that's great questions. So one is I can't give an estimate for the cost to a country for not including vulnerable populations. What I can say is poverty is big business. When we look at these, alternative lending products, they're making billions and billions of dollars off of poor people. We talked about this the other night. Credit card companies make, actually, it's poor people who finance the rewards that credit card companies offer wealthy people. And so there is actually, to your point, there is a lot of commercial interest that really benefits from keeping people poor. And sort of the system is built in a way that emphasizes that. I think that a lot of companies, however, I mentioned that we're all short-sighted, right? We're hyper-focused on the present. And I think the same thing is true with companies, is that they're really focused on their earnings this quarter, which means that they are looking at increasing fees. They're looking at charging overdrafts for poor people. They're not interested in necessarily looking at ways that they can improve people's financial health and well-being, because that's a long-term payoff, right? That is something that they'll get the returns on when that person who otherwise would have completely been detached from the bank becomes somebody who takes out who all of a sudden is able to grow deposits there and invest with them and sort of become a higher yield client. And so one thing is we need to bring companies into the longer term mindset. And from a policy perspective of how do we do that, I think one thing is that we shouldn't actually just be requiring companies to report on quarterly earnings. We should actually be having companies add additional metrics about how they're doing. And I think this is, again, back to this question about the role of government, that a government who basically, poverty it's extremely expensive for a company, for a country as well, because as we mentioned, there's this huge relation between poverty and healthcare, and the government is having to, in many cases, sort of subsidize a lot of healthcare and a lot of additional benefits for people. They're getting sort of a lower tax base. So a government has actually motivations to raise sort of earnings and GDP and all of that stuff across the base. So government actually has the right incentives, and so they could put on some government. So basically they could create sort of regulatory requirements that require companies to report on, being a little bit more transparent about the fees that they're charging people, being more transparent about how many people they're actually helping in this sort of financial space and financial behaviors, as a way to sort of help companies better align some of those incentive structures that currently exist. It's, yeah.
Mi pregunta es sobre lo que mencionaba de los efectos de educación financiera, que pues básicamente no se observan efectos de dar educación financiera exclusivamente, y esto va un poco en contra de gran parte de la literatura, ¿no? Que es lo que ha incentivado que tantas políticas públicas se enfoquen en dar educación financiera. Entonces, sobre los estudios que han realizado, es que la educación financiera tiene que enfocarse en ciertos grupos en los que potencialmente este sea el problema, o directamente es como dejar a un lado la educación financiera para poder crear, no sé, ambientes más propicios? ¿O cuál es el camino que dan los resultados que han obtenido de estos estudios?
Yeah, so in the US, it's about $600 million a year that's spent on financial education. And when we think about, and government does a ton of financial education funding and programs and things like that. A lot of that is coming from grant funding and government funding. And we really should be asking about the effectiveness of the marginal dollar. And when we think about the effectiveness of government, if your goal is to be improving people's financial well-being, there just isn't the evidence base that financial education, a content-based, classroom-based delivery of financial education, is effective. And that $600 million would probably be much more effective in sort of getting better at identifying who within a population could benefit from a financial coach, where they're actually able to kind of walk with them, problem solve through things, or fund incentives for companies to be doing sort of better design on projects, or use that money to basically put it towards initiatives that are focused on increasing evidence of how to improve predictive algorithms to reduce bias within those. Or it could be almost anything better with that money than just a content-based financial education if the goal is to improve financial well-being. If that's not what the goal is, then you don't have to change it. If the goal is they want to just check a box for their corporate social responsibility to say, look at the good things we're doing, fine, keep doing that. It's not actually improving people's life. We should also be continuing to research and figure out how to do it better, right? This whole space of research is pretty young and pretty new still, of this like real direct applications to financial services. And so it could be used to actually help subsidize the cost of making loans that are actually responsible loans for low-income households. Like so a bank has to have a certain amount in reserves before they can make some of these loans, because there's regulatory requirements that they have to be able to demonstrate that they're sort of protected against loss and risk of those loans. And so if the government just gave allowed people to have that money in reserves, that they actually more of them might be able to offer affordable products at affordable rates and invest the time and energy to make sure that it's a product that fits people's life. Or they could use that money to create better financial incentives to encourage savings. Like there's a good deal of research on prize-linked savings, which basically says that let's reward people for making deposits into savings accounts by making it feel like a game, where it's fun, where every time you make a deposit, you have a chance of winning, $1,000. And so we could be funding programs like that actually will encourage growth of savings. The research, the literature and the research around financial education isn't that teaching financial education leads to better outcomes. It's that what you see is people who have better outcomes have higher financial literacy. That correlation exists. The problem is that we don't know the direction of that relationship. And by that, I mean, it doesn't appear that it's a causal relationship in such that if you increase financial education, financial knowledge, that translates into an increase in behavior. What it might be is that people whose environment is set up in such a way for them to be more successful financially might now be much more interested and able to retain information around mutual funds versus single stocks versus bonds, because they're in it and participating in it. But it's not that the knowledge of risks and stocks and bonds drove them to participate in it. And so that's the literature up to sort of just a couple of years ago really basically just said we have a correlation between these things. We don't know if one leads to the other. And then it was in 2014 that this meta-analysis came out as sort of the most robust evidence we have that shows that it is not a direct relationship of increasing, of like sort of providing financial education translates into better financial behavior.
Bueno, yo tengo una pregunta rápida. A partir, digamos, en México ha habido como muchas experiencias en cuestiones de microcrédito y sobre todo también de ahorro informal, ¿no? Durante muchos años las cajas populares, programas, digamos, de ronda, de tandas, en donde las personas de alguna manera logran ahorrar y que son muy exitosas. Y se han tratado también de diseñar diferentes programas a partir de estas experiencias exitosas. ¿Tienen ustedes, digamos, como investigaciones a partir también de estos esquemas mucho más informales y que de alguna u otra manera se puedan llevar hacia modelos, digamos, que no necesariamente dependan de la proveeduría de servicios financieros de instituciones un poco más, digamos, arraigadas con el sistema bancario, por ejemplo?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think that's one of the reasons why we actually do a lot of work with financial technology companies, is because they actually are a little bit outside of the sort of standard traditional financial institution, and they really are kind of focused on how can we use some of these other models that appear to work in different ways and adapt them for financial services. And so, you know, I think there have been, there's a lot of different like companies that are trying to model some of those things. We currently actually are working with a partner called Isuzu, which are basically they are looking at a Tanda system, basically, where it's sort of pooled collective savings. And they can kind of control that experience and make it available at people's fingertips, but they're sort of leveraging sort of this long community tradition of people saving together. And a way to sort of make that easier and faster and more accessible to people. It's you know, and all of it, there is a bank involved that's, you know, helping hold funds and things like that, but they're a little bit more removed. And because within the US the regulations are different, it really allows the fintech system to play a little bit more, to get a little bit more creative in the ways that they can solve some of these challenges. And so, and you know, likewise, universities are also kind of trying to step up into some of these roles of, again, this sort of role of society, and sort of informal lending that is already happening. And one of those ways is more and more universities in the US are offering emergency aid. So essentially, one of the things that they found is one of the top reasons why somebody drops out of college is because of a financial emergency that came up, and they need to work to help sort of provide for this financial emergency, or, you know, all of a sudden they can't afford daycare anymore and they have to, you know, they can't make it to class anymore. It's all kinds of reasons that sort of the biggest thing that gets people to drop out. And so universities actually have now started figuring out ways where, you know, without a bank, they can offer this, you know, $500 emergency aid that that then either the person can pay back or not pay back, and the university is looking at other ways that they can sort of cover that for people. And so there's and ideally the way that this works, right, is that sort of these other players external to the financial service help develop the solutions, and then banks acquire them and embed them and bring them to the mainstream. Because even still, most of these players, they're just not at scale, right? And so you might come up with a really good product that's really good and helpful for some people, but it's still sort of limited because of the reach. Because you go to Bank of America or you go to Wells Fargo, and we're talking millions and millions and millions of customers. and you go to a fintech, and it's like, 50,000 people. And so the idea is that the bank purchases it. However, what happens over and over again is that the bank is purchasing these fintechs, and then it actually strangles the fintech, and you lose that innovation, and it goes back into sort of the regulatory constraints and the business as usual, the financial services. But I think this sort of raises another different or very related question that is, again, people who, the products that are being designed are designed for people who design products. And so, a lot of these products are good for bankers, not good for people who aren't bankers. But I think we should look at communities and think about how communities have organized for some of these reasons. It makes a lot of sense that for a lot of people, they're taking out informal loans from friends and family because they're able and willing to get loans from them. It creates a kind of social fabric already that naturally is increasing repayment rates, because you know that if you burn that bridge, you're not going to have access to it again later. The problem, right, so that's a really great solution for a lot of households. The problem is that not everybody has a network where they can borrow from. We did an exercise with a lot of folks where we asked folks to think about a time where they didn't have any money. And it could be a short period of time, but for this sort of moment, they actually had no cash. And how did they deal with it? And, the stories that most people in the room told were stories about how they were traveling and they went to pull out money from the bank card, and that they froze the card because they thought that they were, that it was fraud. And so now they had 24 hours where they couldn't access any cash. And over and over and over again, the way people dealt with it is they reached out to their network. They contacted friends, their parents were able to send them money. They had this incredible network of people. And I think one of the challenges is that so many low-income households, their network is not always able to provide that additional support when needed. They don't necessarily have the funds. They don't necessarily have the space. And in some places, we've even sort of degraded some of that trust in those communities. That has sort of made some of those solutions not viable for large portions of the population that it should be for. One quick example, Grameen, are you guys familiar with Grameen Bank? Basically, it's this collective, everybody sort of pays into this, this group. You're in a group of people, everybody pays in, and then you take turns pulling out the total pot of money. And it's a very nice economic design because you're only going to get into groups with people that you already trust, that you know that they'll pay their part, because you don't want to be on the hook of the money not being there when it's your turn to take it. So it's a great way to deal with sort of markets where there's incomplete information about people's, their credit worthiness or whatever. So Grameen has now gone all over the world, including in the US. And we've worked a little bit with Grameen America. And one thing that they found is that their model is incredibly successful for some immigrant populations in the United States, specifically, actually, Latino populations in the US. Very, very successful. A lot of participation, great repayment rates, and most of the women are using them for some sort of micro-entrepreneur and small business investments. However, they tried to use the same model in African American communities in New York City. And essentially what they found is a completely different story. completely different participation rates, completely different like repayment rates, all of this. It was very, very difficult for them to have that same model be successful. And one of the hypotheses of this is actually that in the United States, we've had policies that have been designed to undermine trust in African American communities. So we've basically, and so now this product that really relies on this sort of social trust and social network is not effective because sort of we've intervened in ways that hasn't been helpful or beneficial. Yeah, it's very depressing. But it's sort of this idea that we should look at the ways people are currently saving, who's it working for, how do we sort of amplify that, and it's likely outside of the financial system, as you mentioned. The one other thing I would say is that, you know, we think about savings as having to be savings in a bank account, and there's all kinds of reasons why we think that. It's better protected, it's FDIC insured, and so it's, you know, you're at less risk for it getting stolen, for losing it, all kinds of reasons. But it turns out that people actually save in many, many ways. So one of my favorite stories is about Oprah Winfrey. So when she got her first big paycheck for her TV show, the first thing she did is she actually went out and bought tons of towels and sheets. That is a savings decision. She's saving in a durable good. Because it meant that for her, she never wanted to be in a position where she'd have bad sheets and towels again. And so she said, I'm going to save, but I'm going to save in these durable goods. And you actually see people saving in all kinds of different ways. And largely it's because the current system isn't effective for them. But you see people who, in a certain time of the year, when they have income coming in, they fill their freezer with meat. That is savings behavior. They're saving in a durable good because they can't save at a bank because they can't access it. They can't save in different ways. And so what they can do is they can purchase and then freeze. Unfortunately, it's not the cheapest way to save. It's not a way that helps them save in a way that actually grows wealth. But it certainly at least is a savings behavior. And so I think we need to think about, why are people having to find alternatives? How do we take the alternatives that they're using and make them even more beneficial? So.
¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Hola. Bueno, más que pregunta, esto del ahorro comunitario, yo vengo de Jalapa, Veracruz, y es algo muy común. Y creo que ha generado otras cosas, la confianza, como lo que tú mencionabas, que a veces hace falta. Creo que el sistema está diseñado, como también tú mencionabas, la pobreza genera riqueza. Y me parece que es un círculo vicioso. Nos hablabas tú del impacto dramático que puede tener, ¿no? En el IQ, por ejemplo, y todo lo que eso deriva, ¿no? Las personas que no duermen, cómo pueden operar, cómo pueden vivir, cómo pueden hacer cosas. Esta pobreza que también, ¿no?, manda a los niños a la escuela sin alimento, y que eso pues va a hacer que posteriormente deserten. Y creo que es un círculo vicioso tremendo, dramático, en el que sí hay que hacer investigación con respecto a este tipo de ahorro, ¿no?, comunitario, porque creo que genera otras cosas. No sé qué opinas al respecto. Gracias.
Yeah, I think that you're right. We need a lot more research and understanding of these sort of community saving models. I think one of the challenges and an area that I think we need to solve for with the community challenge, with these community savings models, is that they're incredibly time intensive. A lot of times there's a meeting that you have to come to in person, you have to report out. It's spending a lot of time and effort to do it. Incredibly effective for the people that have the time and the effort and that connection to community. But when we think about sort of the scarcity and the tax on resources, as you said, that tax on bandwidth, it's very difficult for them to be able to set aside time to go to these community meetings, to do this sort of savings in this way. And so I think that we need to be thinking of not just these high touch models that are really important and really effective for some people, but how do we also make sure that we're building in better low touch models that require like no time, attention, or effort for people to really benefit off of them. And I think that's a real challenge, because we do see some of the things that work best are these high intensive interventions. You know, we said financial education doesn't work. Financial coaching does. But it is incredible. It takes a lot of time and effort. And so you see huge drop-offs because people don't have the time to do it. And so there is a lot of space here to figure out how do we get the same benefits, but at this low touch. The other thing that I forgot to mention earlier is when we talk about sort of the costs of poverty, huge benefits to poverty, as mentioned, right? I mean, like economic benefit to some portions of the population off of poverty. But there's actually also a lot of costs to poverty in society, and we talked about sort of the increased health costs that that the society bears. But on top of that, actually, there was a study that came out pretty recently that looks at what's the economic cost of financial vulnerability for a company. And this is about the financial vulnerability of their employees. And I think that this actually is a really promising space. You know, when we talk about how do you get sort of shifting that risk away from the individual to back to collectivism, that actually as employers find that this financial instability and financial vulnerability is impacting their bottom line because their employees are stressed at work, they're unable to concentrate on the work that they're doing, and that makes them also stay less, there's higher turnover, that gives grounds and reason for employers to actually try to solve for this, right? I mean, this is why employers offer in the United States health insurance, because that directly ties back to sort of the employer's bottom line. It's why they offer, you know, these additional benefits, is because it goes back directly to the employer's bottom line. And I think that, you know, the space for this growth is for employers to be able to sort of create better savings and behavior and sort of really focus on this lifting of vulnerability. So one of these recent studies showed that of an average trucking company, and so not a massive one, but sort of your average size one in the United States, financial vulnerability costs them multiple millions of dollars every year in avoidable accidents. And it's just that financial vulnerability. It's because their drivers are financially stressed and not paying attention on the road and therefore making mistakes. And if that's costing them millions of dollars, it's very easy then to say, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to think about how we can add on better programs to help people save for emergencies, to give people that cushion. We're going to actually pull out $500,000 that's going to be an emergency aid fund that employees can tap into when they're stressed. That's not going to cost any additional money. It's offered at with no interest rate for credit. And I think that we're going to see a lot of innovation at the employer level to help solve this gap, because that's a place where actually incentives are aligned.
¿Alguien más por acá? ¿No? Bueno, yo tengo otra pregunta rápida. ¿Ya? ¿No? ¿Hola? ¿Hola? Ah, sí, ya. ¿Por qué no? Digo, ya para terminar, porque ya estamos casi a la hora y para no alargarlo demasiado, pero ¿por qué no nos cuentas un poco sobre tu experiencia con cuáles han sido las instancias financieras o los agentes financieros que más abiertos han estado a incorporar los resultados de estas investigaciones? Y si crees que de alguna otra manera, digamos, hay que tratar de identificar ciertos nichos en el ámbito tal vez más local, ¿no? O en el ámbito regional, o cierto tipo de agencias financieras en donde este tipo de resultados se puedan incorporar para mejorar la situación financiera de las personas más vulnerables.
Yeah, so one, in the United States, we have found that credit unions, so cooperativas, are much more excited, interested, and able to incorporate our findings. And this is because there's, again, a very clear alignment of incentives in that credit unions have, as part of their mission statement, the financial health and well-being of their members. And it's an ownership model rather than a client model. And so I think that's a really nice space. We've also had a lot of success working with local governments. And this is, again, because there is this alignment of incentives that local government is really interested in wanting to do better for their citizens, because they're on the front lines. They are basically having to deal with people who are kind of struggling daily. They're who aren't paying property taxes or other taxes because they can't make ends meet. They are delivering social services. They're trying to help feed the homeless, all kinds of things. So again, another nice place where we've been able to really make movement with local governments being really interested in it. But I would also, I sort of made this point a little earlier about the role of financial tech companies, which is kind of a strange and unusual beast because a lot of them are for profit, but they are, a lot of them are young founders who are pretty passionate about trying to solve a problem. Some of them are not doing the right solutions. That definitely happens, and so we do a lot of vetting to figure out if we think sort of folks are aligned. One of the challenges, though, is that as they get more established, because of the way the funding model is for startups in the US, certainly, is that they're funded by venture capitalists who have sort of given money for them to develop and play, and they don't have to worry about profitability in the beginning. It usually means, though, once they get to a certain size, their funders want to pull them up market or figure out how they're going to make money. And so at that point, that's when it starts to get a little bit dicey about whether or not they'll continue to really be focused on helping vulnerable populations. But overall, I think, a lot of times it's outside of the financial sector. There are even with large financial institutions, we've done some work with large financial institutions as well. And what we really try to focus on are these areas where it's both good for the financial institution and good for the individual. And the truth is actually building savings is one of those things, because a financial institution wants more deposits. It's good for them to have more deposits. And so that's a space where they're happy to work. Much harder to get them to work on projects that get people to pay their debt faster, because that sort of hurts their bottom line.
Muy bien. A ver, Gil, por acá.
Gracias. La pensé mucho para participar, pero no me quería llevar esta cuestión en relación con la pregunta de la conveniencia de acceder al sistema financiero por parte de la gente más vulnerable. Y les quiero comentar una historia. Yo me dedico a la defensa principalmente de niños y mujeres maltratados. Y durante muchos años, una forma común de cumplir con la pensión alimenticia por parte del padre que ya no vive en el núcleo familiar era darle al padre, a la madre custodio principalmente, era la mamá la que se quedaba con los niños, era darle a la madre, en lugar de dinero, despensa. Y esto, bueno, ha sido una lucha de muchos años que le cambia la vida a la persona. En el momento en que nosotros logramos, por vía judicial, las más de las veces, que la persona reciba un depósito en su cuenta y no reciba la despensa en físico, le cambia la vida. Y aquí los argumentos, estando en audiencia, eran: yo siempre te doy de más, siempre te pongo de más, pero era desde ¿por qué me tienes que supervisar lo que yo recibo? Por ejemplo, las toallas femeninas y todas estas cosas que son delicadas. No es lo mismo también tener los ahorros en un sistema. Todas las personas necesitamos guardar dinero y ahorrar dinero. Tenemos el mismo problema en el inglés y en el español, no usamos la misma palabra para ahorrar, en el término de economizar, gastar menos, y ahorrar para tener un respaldo para futuro. Y este juego de palabras a veces juega de manera perversa, porque sí pareciera de entrada que estamos tratando de forzar a un grupo vulnerable a que entre a un mercado financiero que también es un mercado agresivo y es un mercado dinámico y que tiene sus propias complejidades y cuesta trabajo a veces entenderlo. Pero en última instancia, todos tenemos necesidad de ahorrar y de acceder a créditos. El problema es que cuando ahorramos de una manera externa al sistema financiero, estamos nosotros siendo mucho más vulnerables. Y cuando accedemos a créditos por fuera del sistema financiero, bueno, pagamos el precio mucho más caro. Y voy a cerrar con este comentario. Aquí en México se hizo famosa una empresa que otorga créditos. Uno podía comprar electrodomésticos, por ejemplo, un batidor, un blender, una licuadora, y pagaba uno $1, así lo anunciaba, ¿no? Era $1.25 en aquella época, era 38 pesos, me parece que era 30 pesos a la semana. Pagabas $1.25 a la semana. Si uno hacía cuentas, la licuadora venía saliendo en una cantidad estratosférica cuando el sistema financiero mexicano estaba impulsando el uso de tarjetas y casi todas las tarjetas daban 6 meses sin intereses. Entonces era paradójico lo que tú decías muy acertadamente: a la gente vulnerable los créditos le salen infinitamente más caros.
Yeah, we have a very similar challenge in the United States, in that, we have all of these like rent-to-own stores where people can rent furniture, and a lot of this is also about access to capital, right? So the cost to buy a couch or a blender or a dishwasher or a stove is a lot of money for somebody to have all at once. And so the idea is that, these companies have really benefited off of saying, great, we're gonna really shorten how much you pay us every day. And because naturally, this is actually something we know about human behavior and sort of the way the brain works, is that we're pretty insensitive to the term of credit. We're really just focused on our monthly payment or our weekly payment. And we say, oh, I can afford $1.25, or 38 cents a week. I can afford that, so I'll go ahead and get it, regardless of the fact that I'm going to be paying that for 5 years to buy a blender. And so these are companies that have really taken advantage of the way that the brain sort of thinks about things and plans for it. And I think that this is a responsibility of government to be able to step in and say these are predatory products, and that it's insane and absurd for a company to be able to make that type of a margin on some of these goods. Again, any comments about policies, role of government? That's coming from Mariel, not from Common Sense Lab or Duke University. But this is a major challenge, and I think government needs to step in. In the U.S., right, we tried to do this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whose essentially entire role was to figure out which of these sort of products, systems, rules were discriminatory or were predatory, and really sort of tamp down on that and create rules around it, because that's not going to change. Completely right that you can't also just cut something off. There has to be an alternative. There has to be a substitute, because people do want to be able to have a blender. They want sort of the benefits that all of these tools give to them, even though they can't come up with the capital to buy it at once. And so we do need to have alternatives and ways for them to do it. We need to have ways for people to access credit when they need it. But we also need to think about what's fair in a system. And a 200% interest rate, or people paying 3 times the cost of something, isn't fair. And I think that's how we need to think about the conversation, not about what people are willing to pay, but actually what's fair. And we've had some success in the US about creating regulations around capping interest rates by using that framing. Because, the people that are lending it say, well, people are willing to pay. People are willing to pay, so it can't be that bad. But the point is that when you just frame it like, is it fair? Is it fair to ask somebody to pay that? That helps a lot.
¿Quieres hacer un comentario?
Perdón, sé que ya es tarde. Una rapidísima. ¿Ustedes han podido medir la relación que existe entre el ingreso de las personas en situación vulnerable al sistema financiero y el perfil de trabajo que ellas anhelan? Les voy a platicar un caso así rapidísimo. En mi despacho la gente recibe los ingresos por medio de nómina bancaria. Cuando suele suceder que los despachos tenemos mucha rotación, sobre todo en ciertas épocas del año, porque, por muchas razones que no vienen al caso. Pero sucede que un patrón muy frecuente es que las personas que salen de mi despacho, si se van a otro despacho que pague de la misma forma, ya no que pague en efectivo, ya no que dé el típico sobrecito con el dinero. Y esto por una serie de comodidades a los que ellos se han acostumbrado, de poder hacer los pagos por medios electrónicos o cosas así. ¿Existe alguna forma de medir, o tienen ustedes alguna medida de la relación de cómo les cambia el ingreso al sistema financiero en relación con el trabajo al que aspiran tener? No sé si fui claro.
I don't know if I caught all of that question. Do you want to just really quick?
Okay. Sí, yo tengo…
Haz la pregunta nada más, ya sin el comentario. ¿Cuál sería la pregunta específica?
Tengo la idea de que las personas que ya tienen acceso al sistema, al sistema financiero, tienen la expectativa de conseguir un trabajo mejor, ya no en la informalidad, bueno, básicamente ya no tener trabajo informal, ya no ser autoempleados o trabajar para la informalidad, sino trabajar ya empleándose o para trabajos más de otro tipo, no sé si…
Es que yo creo que no necesariamente se correlacionan los dos elementos, ¿no?
No sé, yo también creo que no sé.
Yo creo que no necesariamente.
Se me ocurre que pudiera ser.
Sí.
No hay.
Sorry, she's still translating.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the closest thing I can get to here is just this like self-hurting, that we really like the status quo, that we're sort of accustomed and used to. And so if this is the way that it's always been for us, this is the way we expect it to always be for us. And so if somebody's always kind of dealt with money in this way, they kind of prefer to continue getting money in this way. The sort of question about people in the formal sector, like leaving for entrepreneurship or the informal sector, like I can't speak to, you know, we certainly, I don't know the size of this population, the ratio around this, or the measurement around it. I think in the U.S., one of the challenges is that people are stuck in jobs that they don't want to be in, because of a lot of the risk that comes with being in the informal sector, or and because we have so many benefits that are attached to the employer, and you know, we don't like uncertainty, and so we sort of don't want to operate outside of that. Yeah, we can talk more if I didn't answer your question.
Bueno, creo que ya estamos llegando ahora sí, al menos que alguien tenga una pregunta urgente. De todos modos, me imagino que muchos de ustedes van a quedarse para el taller que tenemos a las 4 de la tarde. Si alguien no se inscribió para ese taller, puede todavía inscribirse, nada más si les pediríamos que estuvieran aquí a las 3:30 para poder registrarse y para que podamos empezar la sesión a las 4 de la tarde. La sesión de las 4 de la tarde es más un taller sobre herramientas. No va a ser en esta sala, es aquí mismo en el instituto, pero en la sala Centenario, que está en el segundo piso. Entonces vamos a tenerlo por allá y vamos a hacer un poquito más sobre ciertas herramientas de investigación, un poco para profundizar más en estos elementos y sobre todo tener mayores recursos también como para poder diseñar, ¿no? Una serie de cuestiones a nivel de investigación y de intervención también. Entonces, nos veríamos a las 4 de la tarde, aquellos que están inscritos también para el taller, y son bienvenidos también a quedarse los que no se hayan podido inscribir hasta ahorita y que quieran quedarse. Entonces, dejaríamos una pausa hasta las 3:30, les pediríamos que estuvieran aquí 3:30, cuarto para las 4, para poder empezar a tiempo. A ver, un comentario, y allá también. Sí, se va a habilitar en la semana, no te preocupes. Sí, los vamos abriendo poco a poco, porque si no las personas se registran a todos y después ya no llegan porque se inscribieron hace 3 meses. Entonces, exactamente por estas cuestiones, creo que es mucho más fácil. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos y vamos a darle por favor un aplauso a Mariel por su excelente presentación. Y bueno, nos vemos en un ratito.